Our next speaker is Dr. David Wright. Dr. Wright has been an expert consultant to the Office of Research Integrity since 2001, working with both the Division of Investigative Oversight and the Division of Education and Integrity. He's currently the professor and chairperson of Michigan State University's Department of Community, Agriculture, Recreation, and Resource Studies, where he teaches and writes on the history of science and technology and the responsible conduct of research. Previously, Dr. Wright served as Michigan State University's Assistant Vice President for Research Ethics and Standards, as well as its Intellectual Integrity Officer, overseeing most of MSU's research regulatory compliance activity. He also chaired the university's Committee on Research Involving Human Subjects for 11 years. Please welcome Dr. David Wright.
A short note about my CV. I'm no longer at Michigan State University, but rather at ORI. So what I want to talk about today is, should ORI revise federal policy on plagiarism? And I'll be interested in your response and advice to that when we have a chance to do some discussion. So in contrast to Miguel's talk, this is very different because we're talking about research regulation here, codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. So ORI's handling of allegations of plagiarism is bound by a regulatory definition, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the process in our regulation. It's very serious and time-consuming for a regulatory agency such as ORI to take up one of these allegations. In our case, we have to wait for the research institution to conclude its own investigation, and then we do a de novo oversight investigation. So it takes hundreds of person hours to get this done, and consequently, in all cases, including fabrication and falsification, we only take on what we consider fairly serious matters. Part of that is that when we make additional federal findings, that is, in addition to the research institution's findings, we have to be prepared to defend those findings in an appeal process before an administrative law judge. There's a pretty rigorous burden of proof, and then it can go to federal court after that. So even when we pursue a case, we don't always make a finding. And so this is very, very different from the way allegations are handled at research institutions, the way I handled them when I was a research integrity officer at Michigan State, or the way that I think journals typically handle them. But Stephanie can talk about that when her time comes. So let's talk about the evolution of ORI's position on plagiarism and consider why we think it's possibly time to change it. The ORI current policy on plagiarism was published in December of 1994. The misconduct regulation in place at that time was 42 CFR 50 Part A, which was issued in 1989. That regulation listed plagiarism along with fabrication and falsification as the elements in its definition of misconduct, but it did not define plagiarism. It didn't define falsification. It didn't define fabrication either. The widely accepted working definition of plagiarism in the research community at that time, and the one that we research integrity officers and institutions reviewing allegations of plagiarism under their misconduct procedures was, and there's some latitude to this, but it was essentially that plagiarism is using the words of another without that person's knowledge or permission and claiming them as one's own. The ORI policy went well beyond that quote-unquote common law definition. And it said, I'm going to go through it line by line with you because I think it's important in considering whether we got to change it or not. Although there's a widespread agreement that in the scientific community, including plagiarism as a major element of the PHS definition of scientific misconduct, there's some uncertainty about how the definition of plagiarism itself is applied in ORI cases. Remember, it wasn't defined in the regulation. As a general working definition, ORI considers plagiarism to include both the theft or misappropriation of intellectual property and the substantial unattributed textual copying of another's work. It doesn't include authorship or credit disputes. The theft or misappropriation of intellectual property includes the unauthorized use of ideas or unique methods obtained by a privileged communication, such as a grant or manuscript review. Note how complex that sentence is, for which we have to thank the HHS lawyers, I believe. But that includes unauthorized use of ideas or unique methods obtained by a privileged communication, such as grant review. So it's if you look at it, it's fairly narrowly focused. Substantial unattributed textual copying of another's work means the unattributed verbatim or nearly verbatim copying of sentences and paragraphs which materially mislead the ordinary reader regarding the contributions of the author. ORI generally does not pursue limited use of such identical or nearly identical phrases which describe the commonly used methodology or previous research, because ORI does not consider such use as substantially misleading to the reader or of great significance. Many allegations of plagiarism involve disputes among former collaborators who participated jointly in the development or conduct of a research project, but who subsequently went their separate ways and made independent use of the jointly developed concepts, methods, descriptive language, or other products of joint effort. The ownership of the intellectual property in many such situations is seldom clear, and the collaborative history among the scientists often supports the presumption of implied consent to use the products of the collaboration by any of the former collaborators. This follows copyright law, to which Miguel alluded. For this reason, ORI considers many such disputes to be authorship or credit disputes rather than plagiarism. Such disputes are referred to PHS agencies or to the extramural institutions for resolution. So that's the 1994 ORI quote-unquote policy issued in the newsletter, volume 3, number 1. So as the text of this statement makes clear, it was crafted cautiously as quote-unquote a working definition of plagiarism under 42 CFR 50 Part A. It was never issued as an NPRM, that is Notice of Proposed Rulemaking to those of us in the biz, or published in the Federal Register, which major policies typically are. It later morphed into the ORI policy on plagiarism as it now appears on the ORI website. When I began to think about our plagiarism policy, for reasons I'll get to for a minute, I just assumed that it had been developed back in those days as a formal policy. But like so many other things in big organizations, things happen and people change, and one thing morphs into another, and one web page master changes the rubric or the title, and so pretty soon you have a working definition that's morphed into a formal policy. So the implied standards necessary for making a finding of plagiarism as misconduct under the 1994 policy are that plagiarism be theft or misappropriation of intellectual property, or that plagiarism of text involve substantial unattributed textual copying that, quote, materially misleads the reader as to authorship. So in this quote-unquote policy, there are exclusions and thresholds. The exclusion is authorship or credit disputes, by which I think it means by context, although I think one, from careful reading, can't always be entirely sure. It means disputes amongst collaborators or former collaborators. And then there's a threshold that ORI does not pursue limited use of identical or merely identical phrases which described methods, which Miguel talked about, or lit reviews. And there's some support, at least for the first part of that, by some journals, but nevertheless, it was a clear threshold. And consequently, ORI has made relatively few findings of plagiarism. If you look at the findings that we've made from 1992 to 2013, and I think that asterisk is there because that wasn't complete when this was compiled. Only about, if you combine straight plagiarism and fabrication, falsification, plagiarism and falsification and plagiarism, you can maybe get to 20 or 23 of the, out of 255. So there were a number of reasons why I think back then they took that position. For jurisdictional reasons and reasons of the implied definition, that is ORI, did not deal with self-plagiarism or ghostwriting. The staff resources were limited, and there's also a question of the impact of our findings on the researcher, or we call them the respondent. If you have a paper retracted from a journal, it's embarrassing, but presumably you can walk away from that. If we make a finding of research misconduct against anybody, it is published in the Federal Register, your crime and your name, and it is, for all intents and purposes, immortal. And so we, depending on who it is, it can also be essentially a professional death sentence. And so we are very careful about taking that step, and often when it's a young investigator and, as nearly as we can tell, the first transgression, we pull back from taking that step. But then, in addition, these are standards of proof that we have to make: significance and intent. It's often a difficult matter to assess the significance of a lot of, especially relatively minor cases of plagiarism from our distance for the case. I mean, we are overseeing investigations handled by research institutions, and it's often, especially when there are cultural factors involved, to assess intent, which is something that we have to establish. So reasons 4 and 5 made ORI reluctant to try what it considered relatively minor cases of plagiarism before the Departmental Appeals Board, which was the case under 42 CFR 50 Part A, the old regulation, or before an administrative law judge under the new regulation, when it was unsure whether it could meet the standards for significance or intent. And so, given limited staff and legal resources, ORI chose to focus more on fabrication and falsification, and the figures I showed you reflect that. Now, here are some of the consequences of that policy and reasons for reconsidering it. When institutions made finding of misconduct and ORI didn't make its own findings, remember, institutions make their findings and then we decide, in our oversight review, we can accept an institution's finding even if we don't make our own, if they have erred and, for example, haven't followed their own procedures. We have the capacity to take certain compliance actions. But in any case, when institutions made findings of misconduct and for reasons of uncertain significance, or we couldn't establish intent, or we thought it was too minor a case, we didn't make findings. The research integrity officers at those institutions often felt, quote unquote, hung out to dry, as one of them put it to me once, because their institutions saw ORI's decision not to make findings as criticisms of the institutional process. Although I am now the director of ORI, I used to be a research integrity officer, and this happened to me, in that we had an investigator who was on an NIH review panel and plagiarized a very substantial portion of the lit review section from a grant and then used it in his own grant. This is a really stupid form of misconduct, because who does the plagiarist think they're going to send his grant to? It's so often the same people that they've stolen from, and this happened. Duh. And so but it happens. And further, respondents often typically claimed in such cases that ORI had exonerated them. I mean, our letters specifically say that institutions are free to make their own independent determinations about the conduct of their researchers, and that ORI takes no position on that. For our own internal reasons, we have chosen not to make additional findings, but that is no comment on the institution's findings. Nevertheless, respondents say that they've been exonerated, and they use that to embarrass their institutions. Well, with the notable exceptions of some major institutions which have adopted ORI's definition and policy on plagiarism for the same reasons that ORI initially did. They're big, they have hundreds of compliance issues all the time, and they don't want to deal with minor issues. The University of Washington and Seattle is one such case. I mean, they, I think, are the largest they're the largest recipient of federal research funds of public universities, and second only maybe to Hopkins altogether. But except for some cases like that, most institutions have a considerably lower bar for pursuing plagiarism than has ORI, and a much broader definition, if you've heard from Professor Roy. So this dissonance between research institutions and ORI's approaches has been difficult for both in some cases. So in 2005, a new regulation was issued based on the 2000 OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And ours became effective on June 16, 2005. NSS, I'm sure, as Jim Crow will say, I think was several years earlier. It was 2002, was it? Your revision of, yeah, 2002. This new regulation also includes as plagiarism along with fabrication and falsification as an element of misconduct, but now it defines it. And it defines plagiarism as the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. It is much bigger than the presumed common law. It's much more sweeping in scope than the presumed common law definition operating in the field in the 90s. It's also more sweeping than the ORI working definition issued in 1994. But note that it has to be another person's ideas. So whether self-plagiarism should be actionable by journals and research institutions is a matter for them to decide, but it's not actionable under our regulation. I just said that. This new definition of plagiarism subsumes the elements of the 1994 ORI policy, but it's clearer eliminating the need for discussing intellectual property or unique methods obtained through quote-unquote privileged communication, or worrying about thresholds for the appropriation of another's text to be considered plagiarism. The current PHS definition in 42 CFR Part 93 is also much clearer as to the standard required for making a finding of misconduct. Our old regulation was silent on that, and that standard in the new regulation is significance. And I'll explain that. It's significance as decided in a peer community context. Significance is one of three necessary elements of proof. The misconduct must be committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly, and the finding must be supported by a preponderance of the evidence. So here's where significance appears in the regulation, in the first instance for making a finding of misconduct, and the second for determining sanctions, which we call administrative actions. For making a finding, there must be a significant departure from accepted practices in the relevant research community. So that's how significance is defined contextually. And then in terms of the sanctions, impact, did the misconduct have significant impact on the proposed or reported research record, research subjects, other research institutions, or the public health or welfare? So it gives you a range of possibilities in which to consider significance in terms of impact. So, given that our old and still published quote-unquote policy on plagiarism was developed under a regulation that has now been superseded, I thought that at a minimum it needed to be revisited, and which is why I undertook this exercise. It became more complex as I actually read through the record of how it was developed. But the question is now, would it improve things both for ORI's handling of cases and for our relation with the research community, with whom we work very hard to partner as opposed to being a draconian federal oversight agency, if we just relied on our new definition period that's in the regulation without this policy, or should it be retained? We wanted to, before we made a decision, discuss it with our colleagues in the research community, and that's one of the reasons that I'm talking about it today, to hear your views when the appropriate time comes. There's some other internal considerations for us that you may think are fairly arcane, but actually in practice are not. There is a practice called curb stoning, which happens in survey research. It's a kind of fabrication or falsification, usually fabrication of data in survey research. And what it means, essentially, where the term comes from, I think deliciously, is it means instead of knocking on doors and doing surveys, somebody sits on the curb and makes up the results. Hence curb stoning. And this, it turns out, is a very widespread phenomenon. And in fact, people from leading survey institutes at major universities and also places like Gallup and even the US Census, some of them say that if they didn't have very tight oversight procedures, that the curb stoning might account to up to 30% of the data. And so they have very elaborate internal protocols for detecting curb stoning. And what they typically do is delete the text and fire the person who did it, just sort of automatically. These people are usually part-time workers and not members of what we might call the research community. or the scientific research community. So there came a time when ORI told a university, when this had been reported, I think by an outside complainant, that in fact they were, in doing this expunging and firing, destroying data necessary to ascertain whether misconduct had in fact occurred, and preemptively firing somebody without a trial unfairly. And so we had, I was a consultant back then. This was 2004 maybe, I don't remember exactly, a big conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which had a major research institute of maybe 19 or 20 major survey research organizations, including the US Census and Gallup and that sort of thing. And they proposed a threshold below which, and it was a statistical threshold for, if in a big survey, if it was one researcher and his or her fabrication or curbstoning of data amounted to, something like less than 0.75% of the total data set. I'm making this up, but it is a very low level, that they not have to report that. And they pointed to the ORI threshold in the plagiarism policy as justification for taking that position, but the HHS lawyers wouldn't buy it. And they said, no, there can't be a threshold in that case. So we had this kind of dissonance between thresholding in one area of alleged misconduct and not in another. So were we to withdraw the old policy, it would have it would clean up some internal difficulties as well. Well, those are the end of my prepared remarks, but I'm here because we really would be interested in your advice, and when the time comes, I hope to talk with you about it. Thank you.